Now I'm going to talk about a little bit about the history of photography and go over a few key dates and points and describe a few things. If you, in your book, from page 201 to about page 220, there's a great timeline in the National Geographic book. It's photos is Greek for light and graph for drawing. So basically what you're doing is drawing with light. And as you've read through your book, and I've talked about a couple times, it's basically the camera is just something that captures light. And I'll explain that a little bit more. The pinhole was written about as early as 4th and 5th centuries. So the idea of photography has been around for about 2,500 years. So even though it's only been capturing the image on a light sensitive material is only about 200 years old, the actual idea of it is much, much older than that. Okay, something that any photographer should know is the term camera obscura, which it simply means dark chamber. So that's all our camera is. It is a dark chamber that has a lens or a hole that allows light to come in it. And of course, our digital cameras are much more advanced than early photographers had, but it's basically the same thing, a dark box with a hole. Now your aperture is basically the size of that hole. We can control that with the settings in our camera. Long ago, of course, they would just have a single hole, and then you would cover it with your hand or a dark piece of board or something, and you could uncover it to let light in and cover it back up. So that was the shutter. So here's an example of a camera obscura. So this is basically a big black box that an artist would sit in. And of course, this wall is just open for us to see the inside. And there's a hole in the wall, and the surface over here would be white. So sun comes down, hits the landscape scene here, shines through the hole, and is projected on the white wall upside down. So this is basically just a large camera. And you'll notice a lot of early paintings, of course, a lot of them outside, or portraits were taken outside or near a window. And artists would use this technique. So if you're in your castle or your chateau, you could have two rooms next to each other, one room completely blacked out, the other room the family or the subject would sit in, and you would just put a hole through the wall and the image would be projected on the wall. So you could get a very, very good likeness. Here's another example of that. So light reflects off the subject, projected on here, and then the artist can basically trace the image. Today you might see a camera obscura at a fair or a science museum. They still make them, and some travel around that you can kind of see and see what people were using hundreds and hundreds of years ago. You can also make yours today. This is basically same thing, someone's room, and they blacked out the room, cut a hole in the wall, or covered the windows, and there was a hole in the paper covering the windows. And this is the scene of St. Louis that was outside. And show you a YouTube video. I haven't tried this one yet. So the first photographs, fixing an image to a surface. So of course we know that light comes through a hole into a dark chamber. Hundreds of years ago, artists would draw that image onto a white surface. So scientists for the longest time were trying to figure out how they could use chemical to capture that light onto a surface. And that came about into the 1800s. And Daguerre and his daguerreotype is the most famous. He's a Frenchman, and he took his first photo of a person in Paris in 1839. And for the longest time, all the way up until about the 1900s, it was chemists and rich men that were involved in photography and making these discoveries. Glass plates were used, and of course they're heavy, they're toxic, breakable, long exposures, which were several minutes. So if you were taking a photograph of a person, they would have to sit there for an incredibly long amount of time. So a lot of the early photos aren't, of course, of people. They're of landscapes or objects and those sorts of things. You'll see famous photos of the Civil War battlefields, and it's many just dead soldiers on the battlefield. And of course, they could have those long exposures. Film was a huge breakthrough, and George Eastman founded Kodak. We all know the word Kodak, and Kodak doesn't mean anything. George Eastman thought it was catchy and it sounded good. It wasn't anybody's name, doesn't mean anything. He just picked that name. And he, of course, developed the first transparent roll of film. And that led, of course, to the boom of the movies in the early 1900s. Because, of course, you would have a long roll of film, expose each one to a little bit of light. That loop at 24 frames a second would create a movie. The huge leap forward in getting the camera into everyone's hands, to the middle class, and evolved into more of a snapshot type of photography was the Brownie camera. You could purchase a Brownie camera, and their slogan was, "You press the button, we do the rest." Before this time, if you wanted to develop photos, you had to have your own darkroom pretty much, or live in a bigger city, and they might have a darkroom where you could pay someone to do it. But this, anybody in a rural town could get a camera, take their roll of film, send it off to Kodak, and Kodak would send back photographs. So that really put it in the hands of the common person. This is an example of a Brownie. It's a little bit later version. Your book has one of the earlier ones. This one actually has a viewfinder on it. So there's a little mirror here, so you would look straight down into there, and it would, of course, see your subject. This is where your shutter would be. So you'd push this little lever down. This would open up and let the light in, and then you turn this crank to get your next piece of film. So color film, and in our book it tells us that the exact first color photo was in 1861, but color photographs really didn't develop until the early 1900s. And of course, most notably for Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz. And if anyone in conversation says, well, Wizard of Oz was exactly when color film came about, because there's that rumor that it came out halfway through the movie, and that's why they filmed the second half in color and the first in black and white. That's completely not true. Color film had been around. It was just so much more expensive to use than black and white. The whole process was different, and it wasn't affordable for most people. And yeah, it wasn't until the 70s and the 80s did color take off. And one of the big things was that color film needed a lot more light. So in low light situations, it just didn't look good. So it forced people to buy camera bulbs. And before today's technology, it was actually a glass bulb with chemical in it that would pop and flash, and every bulb only got one use. Whereas now on our cameras, it's thousands or hundreds of thousands of uses per flash bulb. So the cost was much greater to get good quality images in low light. So that's one of the reasons why color just really didn't take off. So then we step forward into digital photography. And it's kind of hard to believe that the first digital camera was 1975 by Kodak. And it's also amazing that Kodak now has gone bankrupt, but they were the pioneers of digital photography. But of course, Kodak was trying to do so many different things. with digital cameras and printers and still trying to produce film and all these other things. And that's probably one of the main reasons why they went bankrupt, but it's still amazing that they were the pioneers of it and weren't able to make it in today's contemporary photography. So the first portable, or the first digital camera was described as portable, and here's a photograph of it. And it doesn't seem very portable to me. Here's a couple more dates. And I'm not going to give you a quiz on dates, as long as you kind of know that in your life, the first photographs were in the mid 1800s. Color film came around in the early 1900s. Digital photography in the 70s, and really didn't become into, of course, here the consumer portable cameras in the early 1990s. And I didn't even get my first digital camera until I think the early 2000s. So it still wasn't in everyone's hands until fairly recently. So please look through your book and read the timeline and some of those dates in there. Some of it's pretty interesting stuff, and the kind of big leaps that photography has taken over the years and how far it's really come just simply in the last 150 years, from not being able to capture light to now being able to capture light on a digital sensor. And how portable it is, with everyone having a camera in their back pocket, in their phones, or a digital camera, and how that's changed the realm of photography, with basically being able to take millions of photos for free, whereas just 20 years ago or 30 years ago, you had to buy film, and every image had to be thought about because you were spending money on it, whereas now it's more of a throwaway culture of photography. So read through those pages, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.